So first and foremost, we have Dianne Johnson, the chair of our Policy Advisory Board. She's the past president of the Houston ISD Board. She does consulting work, a lot of analytical work, Houston A+ Challenge. The list goes on and on and on. Sterling, yes, so much. And when she was on the school board is when Houston launched and passed the teacher evaluation and compensation system that pretty much put Houston on the map as a leader, especially in Texas, as being very reform-minded and trying to elevate the teaching profession. Now, the person who was actually implementing that in Houston ISD is Ann Scott. She was like the chief human capital officer for HISD. She then went to Raise Your Hand Texas and is now back at Houston ISD Foundation. So we're really glad to have her. We have Stacey Hodge, who you have to talk to her while y'all are here. She's outstanding. I met her when she was actually a classroom teacher coming to Austin to testify on some teacher quality legislation. And from there, she became a leader in Dallas ISD as kind of a teacher voice and trying to engage and empower teachers to jump on the bandwagon, to be a different type of voice, to engage in these different changes in policy structures that will lead to greater professionalism for the teaching profession, especially in Dallas. Now she's with Stand for Children. She's executive director of Stand for Children in Dallas. We have Representative Travis Clardy from Nacogdoches, Texas. He is the chair of the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Committee in the Texas House of Representatives. So he obviously has a big stake from that perspective as to what our teacher workforce looks like. So thank you for taking the time to be here. And last but not least, I think I'm in the shadow, it is Dr. Hanushek, who is just my idol. Brief story, I got to meet him several years ago and I completely geeked out. Like, it was like being starstruck. It was like George Clooney. He is my George Clooney. So, but he is at the, he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and does a lot of economics work, but that has a lot to do with the teacher workforce, teacher quality, and all those different things. What I also want to note before I pass the baton to Dianne is that so many times today, people have been quoting these sound bites that people know and use, frequently in our just jargon around education policy and teacher quality that are actually his work. So, thank you. Thank you.
Well, we have been talking about teacher quality all day, and so even though I want us to all go around and we're going to start with Rick, but maybe spend about 3 or 4 minutes talking about our involvement with the whole teacher quality issue. But I will just tell you, my head is bloody but unbowed. Courtney referenced the fact that when I was president of the board, we started a performance pay. So it really was the carrot and not the stick. It wasn't the evaluation part, and really TIER's founder, and probably how Jim and I got to be such good friends, he's the one that introduced me to the whole notion of value add. And I share Courtney's opinion of Rick. I just write papers and quoting, so to be on the stage, I just don't want to talk very long. And Anna referenced this, in talking about government, actually what I find when I say that my head is bloody but unbowed, so 10 years later, HISD has always sat with some sort of compensation the value of teachers, really going back to Billy Reagan and the Second Mile program, but particularly expanded under Rod Page and Don McAdams, and performance pay for schools that performed as a team. And when I got on the board, we took it to the classroom level and we stood with that. And this year, for the first time in decades, they took the last $10 million and decided not to fund anything that places a value on quality of teaching. So I would love it if we could start the conversation again, and maybe even HISD would hear and understand it. So I want to go next to Rick, and I think you have some slides, and then we'll just move on. Travis, you, and then Stacey, and then Ann. 3 or 4 minutes each. Okay, great.
Well, thanks very much. I think this is a very unfortunate introduction to me. The expectations have been set way too high. But as an economist, I wanted to actually follow up on one of the last things that the commissioner said about essentially this is in your own self-interest. And I have been quite excited to see that the whole country has started to recognize the importance of quality teachers and that that's on everybody's agenda. What worries me a little bit is that it's now so common to say that people just nod their head and say, of course it's teacher quality. And then the next line often is something like, but changing that is really tough. You know, it really takes a lot of work, and I'm not sure that it's worth doing this much to do it. So what I want to do is just show you a couple pictures, some slides, if I can, there, of the Economist version of teacher quality. Now, it turns out that we know a lot about the difference in the effectiveness of teachers across classrooms now. There's been a lot of work done over the last 2 decades that give us a good idea of what's the distribution of teacher quality. We also know, and that's teacher quality measured in terms of what they add to the learning of students. We also know what it means for a student to know more. Because if we look in the labor market, we find people that know more systematically earn more. If you just put those two together, you can get a quick estimate of what is the value of a really good teacher in the classroom. And that's what I'm going to do. So here's a picture. This is a picture based upon the data for the whole US, not just Texas, but there is some Texas data in this. Let me explain what this picture is. Along the horizontal axis, which has a 0 in the middle, is how many students are in a teacher's class. So if you have any teacher of any quality, their impact is going to be determined by how many kids they influence at any point in time, and their influence will go up. This dotted line here is the economic value in terms of the future earnings of her students of a 75th percentile teacher. So you see it starts, if they have no students, the impact is 0, and it goes on up to, if you look at 30 students, the impact summed over all of the students in the class is $430,000 in their future income, compared to just the average teacher. This is the added impact of a 75th percentile teacher compared to the average teacher. If you had a 90th percentile teacher, it would be even more. That's a steeper line because each and every year that teacher is adding more. This is the annual impact of a very effective teacher. Now the opposite side of this, obviously, there's a bottom, and what you see is a 10th percentile teacher is subtracting about as much as the 90th percent teacher is adding. In fact, every year that 10th percentile teacher is subtracting $800,000 in the future income of her students compared to an average student, average teacher. The point is, those numbers strike me as very large. And if we say at this time that, well, it's really tough to make these decisions, it's really tough to make these decisions, you have to be clear about what the implications of that are. Now let me give you one other quick example that I'm going to pick up on later, and that is, think of lining up all of the teachers in the country, starting in Austin, and I guess if you lined them up in terms of their effectiveness, they would stretch in a long line to maybe Denver. And then start at the Austin end, at the lower end, and not to suggest that Texas teachers are worse than average, they aren't, and replace the bottom 1% with an average teacher, or the bottom 2% with an average teacher, and just move up. This is a line based upon a very conservative estimate of difference in teacher effectiveness. The closer teachers are together, the less impact this would have. If all teachers were the same, it would make no difference replacing the bottom one with the average, but as they get farther apart, it makes a difference. This is a picture of the impact estimated nationally, and the way to read this is there's Canada, which is way ahead of us. Arguably, Canada looks a lot like the US, a little bit colder, but it looks a lot like the US. This says that if you replace maybe 8% of the teachers with an average teacher, you would get to the level of Canada. Now, if teachers are wider apart, a plausible upper bound on this would be this blue line that says, well, maybe only 5% of the teachers replaced with an average teacher will get you to Canada. That is a big number, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but I just want to plant that in your mind that making decisions in cases where there is no doubt about who those bottom 2% of the teachers are in any school of the country. There is no doubt about it. But whether we have the ability or ways to implement a system that identifies them and replaces them with an average teacher, or the average teacher is quite good, would get us to Canada, that's the question that the rest of the panel is going to take up.
Well, and I just want to add, I mean, you know, there's so much talk about testing, and I'm hardly a teacher basher. My grandmother taught, my mother taught, my husband taught, I taught, and our daughter taught. We talk about teaching, and we act like, though, that we just found out that some teachers are better than others. I can tell you, I've been in the teacher's lounge, and you get those 4 kids that were in Miss So-and-so's class, and they say, God, you know, you go in and say, God, they didn't learn a thing last year. We all know it, and we know what their names are. And the fact that we pretend that this just happened, or we just had this revelation, or testing caused, I tell you, the people in education that have ever been in a faculty workroom, they know it exists. So anyway, Travis, you are in the position to change this. We had it earlier, and you weren't here, but I've got to tell you, we are, according to the National Council for Teacher Quality, we are one of only 8 states that do not use student achievement learning as part of the evaluation. Take it.
Well, first off, I just want to thank Eric for not performing this kind of statistical qualitative analysis on legislators. The lines would be much worse. So, but with that said, you know, I said, are there going to be any gotcha questions here today? She said, I'm not going to set you up, and I'm part state representative, part bowling pin apparently, because I get to follow the good doctor from Stanford. But this was an interesting analysis, and then I took the same takeaway, which is, here's a surprise, there are some teachers are really better than other teachers, right. And that's going to have a direct impact on the ability of the students to learn, and then prospectively their economic interest going forward. So, and it is interesting to quantify that. I think part of the problem we've seen in education, though, is a resistance of the teaching profession to somehow acknowledge that or deal with that in a quantitative way, to where we can compensate those teachers that, in my parlance, are rock stars. How do we identify those and reward them for exemplary performance? And how do we weed out those who need to seek out a different profession? And I'm not impugning anybody's motivations or intent as teachers, but we have to put a better product on the field, as it were. And this is certainly a worthwhile exercise for us to go through and try to study ways to do it. So, you know, one thing I'm encouraged by, you know, Commissioner Marath, I'm sure he's taken off to his next engagement, but we'd invited him out to Nacogdoches. We did the Lone Star Legislative Summit, had 24 state reps, 7 senators, 4 commissioners, had it on the campus of Stephen F. Austin State University, which, as you know, was founded as a teacher's college. So education is near and dear to our hearts. We deal with these issues all the time. Only I'm worried about Commissioner Marath. If we can get him to approach these issues thoughtfully and passionately, I think he may be all right. I think he may be all right. But I was so encouraged by the things he said that morning at the breakfast. First time I'd ever heard him speak publicly. And I think he'd only been on the job about a month when he came to speak in Nacogdoches. And the one thing he said, which I think is germane to this conversation, he said, we have got to do a better job. He said, we have got to love the people who love our kids. I'm sure you've heard him say that, but I think that's at the heart of it, really at the root of it. How do we get people in the classroom who are going to engage with the children and be there? So on one hand, we're challenged to come up with a quantifiable analysis of who's doing a good job, because the hardest part about it is teaching and education is so subjective. At its very root, it is subjective. It is the farthest thing from a one-size-fits-all exercise that you have. And as you know, from my perception at least, and having raised 4 sons, that different students are going to learn at different speeds. We all know that. Different teaching methods are going to work for different students at different times. What may work for this kid this week is not going to work on that same kid 2 months later, and all the pieces are moving all the time. And so that's the challenge of the teaching profession. I do think in the legislature there's a broad consensus and a respect and appreciation for our teachers, for our administrators. I'm hoping to continue to be able to serve in the education arena in the legislature, assuming I can sneak past the November election. But if we do that, this is an area I want to work on, because fundamentally I enjoy this work, and I enjoy the group of people in this room, the people that are educators, because it is a caring, positive, forward-looking group of people that are trying to do what's best for the future, not only of our country and of our economy, but of our citizens and of our children. So again, thank you for inviting me. Those are just some random thoughts.
Well, very, very good. Thank you. Stacey, you've had experiences, you want to share some in Dallas, and you've also given some testimony on some legislation, and I don't know if you want to include that in, but tell us about where you are on this whole issue of teacher quality, and most of all, where you've been.
Right, okay. So a little background I think will help with where I'm at now. In 2013, I was in my second year of teaching in Dallas ISD and got a call up with Teaching Trust to be this Ed Policy Fellowship. So we came down to Austin, and HB 5 was being discussed. And I actually got called up and sat next to Commissioner Williams, and Senator Patrick asked me, how many EOCs do you think kids should have? And I was like, it doesn't matter. If they're learning and teachers are teaching them, it doesn't matter how many EOCs there are, they'll be fine. That was my launch into education policy. As I sat there and listened, I'm like, why are you asking me this? Like, this is not what I do. But I also sat next to, a couple other times, I actually got invited back to, I think it was SB 893, 1403 actually, on the teacher evaluation that the Texas Commission had put the work together on. And I sat with, and nothing against teacher associations, but I sat next to the 2 on one side and 1 on the other as we're testifying, and they said, all teachers believe. I said, really? I actually belong to this group, and you never asked me what I believe. So it was a wake-up call to me to say, who's telling you guys, right, senators, representatives, what it is that we want? And after being in Austin a few times and hearing this, and actually hearing several questions from the senators asking questions like, I jokingly said, well, when we get back after spring break, we got to start covering up our walls. And they said, why would you cover up your walls? What are you talking about? I said, STAR testing's coming. So what? And I said, we can't have anything on our walls. Everything has to be covered up. They all leaned forward and said, why? Something you guys told us that we had to do. And they looked at each other, and Senator Patrick actually said, maybe we should be a little more careful with what we write into law. And it was at that point that I said...
That was before I served.
Just to be clear. I wasn't trying to insinuate. So. But it became really clear to me that the teacher voice, the grassroots voice, was not at the table. And so I went back and started having conversations with teachers in Dallas that I taught with and said, something has to change. Yeah. Otherwise, things keep coming down to us, right. And we're allowing it to happen. Like, we're allowing this. So how do we bring it up? How do we say, hey, if this happened, we'd do a much better job. These things would happen. So 3 years ago, I left the classroom and I became director of Stanford Children. And if you guys know Stanford Children, typically it's parent organizing and parent engagement around education. Well, I've got the ability and a lot of flexibility. I actually organize teachers now. And so it's awesome. So I love Commissioner Morath. He was with Dallas ISD, and we did a lot of work with the Teacher Excellence Initiative, TEI, in Dallas, and a lot of teachers believe in this stuff. And we could go on and on about, well, teachers don't want and this and that. It's not true, and we can get into this later with questions, but
It's fabulous.
yeah.
Okay.
So I'm excited. I love this.
We're going to, in another question, we'll want to know the numbers and how many you can turn out with this alternative voice, because that helps Travis get those things whenever they pass it. So,
Absolutely.
Ann, you were the implementer of a whole lot of things at HISD, but before that, and I can't remember if Courtney said, but Ann was executive director for Teach for America, so in Houston. So she was dedicated to this whole quality thing.
And before all of that, I was a teacher in HISD as a Teach for America Corps member, and I come to this work and thinking about teacher effectiveness, having fully drunk the circa 1996 Kool-Aid at the Teach for America Institute, believing that teachers matter most. Before there was a whole lot of data to suggest we were right, we were trained to go into classrooms believing that we were the adult responsible for the student outcomes, and that even if nothing changed in our school, even if our principal wasn't great, even if our mentor wasn't helpful, even if our parents weren't involved, it was my job to ensure that my children were ready for first grade. So I really come to this conversation with my roots in that belief for the last 20 years. Can't believe I've been doing this for 20 years, but 20 years in this work. And to your point, my trajectory has been through Teach for America as the leader of Teach for America's work in Houston, and then on to HISD as the Chief Human Resources Officer, where we worked on our teacher effectiveness initiative. And I really like to couple the term teacher quality with teacher effectiveness, because teacher quality really, to me, indicates a set of inputs in terms of where the teacher potentially went to school, what he or she studied, kind of what is the sauce that makes the teacher. Teacher effectiveness is what happens in the classroom every day on behalf of students and is rooted in outcomes. And that was really our focus in HISD. And we can talk more about the nuts and bolts of what we did. But our real impetus was to ensure an effective teacher in every classroom, and recognizing that there were some interrelated pieces, including teacher performance appraisal, which we've talked about, and we can talk a lot more about what we did in HISD, how we developed our teachers and really moved the middle to perform at higher levels, how we recruited and selected people, and then really, I think most importantly, and I'll talk about this as well later on, how we compensate teachers. I think it's a critical issue that we scratched the surface of in HISD, but didn't touch in a way that I think makes a significant impact. And so those sort of things are what bring me to this conversation.
Okay, so before we do even more detail, because I want us to do all of it, but there's this whole notion of what it is. What's the yardstick that we're going to use to measure this whole effectiveness? And Jim and I, got into EVOS and value add, and that's what HISD, and that now, 10 years later, that's the black box. I mean, it's the mystery, and it doesn't matter if it's, and yesterday, former Commissioner Williams talked about maybe you don't use value add as the term anymore, you use growth. And I'll just be clear, I thought at the time if you do use value add and you factored in that child like, I don't try very much or I try a whole lot, that you were doing teachers a favor. But growth, pre and post test, I'm fine with that if they are. If they prefer that over the other, that's terrific. But let's talk about it. We also have the T-tests, the new evaluation. The Texas State Teachers Association has filed a lawsuit, and among the other things that they have said in the lawsuit is that it is not based on observable job-related behavior. So I'd love to hear from all of you. And Rick, how do you respond? And are there other better measures for using student achievement in evaluations. What's the yardstick?
So I think that there are many alternatives that can be used, and that's sort of what's been talked about here, is that ultimately you have to convince the people in the schools that you have a fair measure and that it is reasonably related to your objective, which is student learning. Different places are trying different combinations of value added and calculated in various ways, but largely other objective observational methods. So if you looked at Washington, D.C., which has probably the longest running functional teacher evaluation system, it is a little bit value added, 35% for the 20% of the teachers that can be evaluated with value added. But for everybody else, it involves a very thoughtful protocol of observing classroom teachers. And then they use, the key is that they use the information. So they give large bumps in the base pay of the best teachers to try to keep them. And they fire teachers that are at the bottom and that are harming kids. DISD is now deeply into changing the evaluation system to include a combination of value added plus a lot of other observational and survey information for both principals and teachers. We always say teachers, and maybe the commissioner said before, you should always say principals and teachers in any discussions. I think that there's a lot of options because if you looked at my last picture of what would happen if we just replaced the teachers that unfortunately are harming kids and are staying in the classrooms, there's no question, as everybody said, about who those teachers are. Nobody, you can ask the principal, the other teachers, the parents, the janitors will tell you who are the teachers that shouldn't be there. It's just a matter of implementing a system locally that can be used to, in fact, improve the whole system and to reward the people that are really doing a good job, which is the vast majority of the teachers in the schools.
And let me pick that up there. One of the challenges is kind of a constant within the legislature. There's a desire to have an overall broad solution to a problem from a state level developed by experts in the field, but the id to that is the desire for us to have local control. And personally, and this may be heresy to some of this room, but I believe very strongly, he who stands closest to the fire fights it best. And we have qualified, talented, educated superintendents, teachers, principals, administrators throughout the state of Texas. And they know exactly, they're closer to those lunchrooms, and they know who the best teachers are. And we need to allow them to do their jobs. Right now, there's one thing I will say I was at the legislature for, and that was when we significantly reduced the number of intercourse examinations, the STARS test, from the high of 15. Personally, I don't think we need any. And so, but the objective criteria that we need, in my way of thinking, we want to know year to year to year, how are we performing compared to years past in decades of data. Those tests are already in existence. I think everybody nearly takes them. It's the PSAT, the SAT, ACT. We have a yardstick. Now you say, well, by the time we get that information, it's too late to come with those children early in the career. But statistically, it tells us in Texas, are we on par with what we've done historically or not, or are we improving? I would much rather return the decision-making on what tests are given, what walls you have to cover up, all these things back to an elected school board that's close to home. That said, there has to be some guidance, some care given to what are those expectations. We can't, you can't just turn it completely loose. There has to be something there to say these are what we need to do. But for too long we've had the testing tail wagging the education dog. I think we're moving away from that. I think we're looking at more dynamic public education into higher education with more career technology focus. Not every successful person has to go across a college campus. There's other ways to do that. We need to match aptitudes, with attitudes and opportunities. That's the challenge. But again, that's not done well from Washington, D.C. on any number of issues. And I come to Austin frequently. I don't feel like I get any smarter when I'm in Austin. In fact, the opposite may be true. So let's get it back to where the parents and the kids and the teachers are, and let more decisions be made locally. And I would suggest that we will have better results.
Comments, Stacey?
I have a question, actually. So does that mean you don't think there should be a teacher evaluation?
No.
Based upon achievement and other things?
I think there does need to be a teacher evaluation, but the evaluation does not need to be made by some complicated formula developed in Austin applied to a teacher in DeSoto or El Paso or Brownsville or wherever it happens to be. I think that evaluation needs to be made by the people who know what teacher are the best, who've actually seen that teacher perform. Because teaching is so, as I said before, education is so subjective, as is teaching. So how do you do that by whatever criteria is being developed? So yes, you've got to be able to make sure we have the best teachers possible in the classroom. How do we do that? We do that by providing a quality work environment and quality compensation. I will tell you anecdotally from the teachers, I represent 3 counties in East Texas, and as I talk to teachers there, issues that come out, we have a fairly high turnover within the classroom. I think in one of our school districts, most recently, I think 40% of our teachers have less than 4 years of teaching experience. That implies there's a significant amount of turnover in the school district. I think that's probably consistent. Things that make them go out of the teaching profession. Part of it is money. But a big part of it, I will tell you, is frustration with having to comply with a bunch of dictated rules that come out of Austin or out of D.C. on some of the No Child Left Behind things. Another big part of it is student discipline and their ability to teach, because the classroom is not the same classroom. We talked about this at a school board meeting. I said, I can talk this issue. I spent most of my scholastic career in the principal's office. I know something about the discipline in the classroom. But in my day, that meant you were throwing pencils on the acoustical tile or putting gum under the desk. Very different today that our students have to deal with. They can't just teach. They have to be mom, dad, counselor, teacher, best friend, and oh, by the way, I'm going to try to teach you algebra. And so it's a much harder challenge our teachers face today.
So I'm going to take you up on that one just a little bit. Having been a teacher, I'm going to give you an example. So the system that's been in Texas since '97, I think, which is PDAS. My first year teaching, there's 10 domains, I believe, right? 8 of those domains, I exceeded expectations. Very subjective. I said, how do I get better? You're good. Those other 2, if you'll show me how you met exceeded expectations, I'll give you exceeded expectations on those. I was baffled and dumbfounded because I came from a corporate world. And to not have a metric that is not just subjective, but that shows me whether or not I move kids. This is not just about you, okay? This
I
is
thought
just
you said I wasn't going to get picked on today.
you put the little girl next to him, right? I think one
Not
of the
if you
things.
dig a hole. That doesn't count.
Yeah, I forgot Ann Richards, the first rule of hole is put down the shovel and stop digging.
That's right. Just saying with this group.
I think the thing that we need to think about, and I would just challenge everybody to think about, is our point is to move our kids, okay? If I don't have, and I think, I just see him still as Mike, but Commissioner Morath, he talked about a North Star, basically, right? If we don't have a North Star and we're not all going towards the North Star, we can't say, hey, we're gonna have a bunch of baseball teams, but you get to use a basketball and you get to use a soccer ball and we all have to be on the same place and we have to be playing by the same rules. And one thing I know to be true is if you left it up to school districts to make up what they were gonna do evaluation-wise, they need the easiest, quickest tool. They have too much on their plate to create their own stuff. It took us almost 5 years to get what's going on in Dallas. I can imagine what it took in Houston because there was a lot of teacher conversation that happened within that, making that come to life.
But let me say this by analogy. Campuses are graded. And we all know that each campus or school district does not have the same raw material present at that first level of instruction. To me, where the focus of education and improvement of education should be, are you getting the most with what you have? So it's one thing to say, oh, at Highland Park we generate, to use Mike's example, 99% of our students go to college and 100% are prepared to go to college. But if you're in the Valley, you're going to have an entirely different statistic. But the question is, have we moved the delta forward? Have we done more with what we have to produce a better student?
And I think
And
that's
so-
the
and that-
growth value
That's the
add
problem with an objective
concept.
standard versus, so there's a, I hear what you're saying.
So
and
I'm going to
look at
jump in here because
it.
here's
Well, I want
why.
to hear from Ann, because you're still
Well,
picking on me.
just because you keep cutting me off.
All right, this is going to be a,
No,
honestly, I
seriously.
can't
So-
sit here
I know,
moderating with
you're
my
gonna have to
phone.
slap me on the hand. So I think your point is like, thank you for setting me up. Highland Park and the Valley, okay? So we have a few schools in Dallas ISD, elementaries in particular, that's where people want to send their kids, right? When TEI came about, guess who put up the biggest fight? Where the teachers were. They were in those schools. Why? Because those kids were already naturally moving forward. They were those kids that did their thing. And when a teacher evaluation such as TEI came into effect, where you have student surveys, you have observations, we're still observing, and we do growth metrics on them, those teachers did not move as much as the teachers
That's right.
that were in lower performing schools. So my objection would be that bring it on, because those teachers that are teaching at those supposedly higher performing elementary schools, they should be moving those kids too. And it's not fair to those kids that it appears that they're in a good school. And I think as a teacher, and you have to shut me up, I'm sorry. But as a teacher, you've got to have, we want to be held accountable. We do. I think the single biggest issue across the state and across the country is you don't go to teachers and ask them to be a part of the solution. You say, hey, we have the solution, do you agree? That's where we get into trouble. It's
And I'll
about
just
communication.
offer that that's
Okay,
what
and
we
we
did
wanna
in
go
Houston.
here.
Good segue, go.
We worked to design a new teacher performance appraisal system, and I'm going to invite my friend Anna Eastman to heckle me if I'm saying anything that's out of date, because it's been 4 years. But we used a design process that involved teachers and principals and community members over 8 months to both design and define the observable competencies that we believed you needed to be able to identify when you stood in the back of the classroom, and also to agree upon the objective measures for which we would hold teachers accountable to 50% of their evaluation. And so it was a combination of multiple factors, but it was a process that involved teachers. And I will tell you, when I sat at the board meeting where our board courageously adopted this system that would hold teachers accountable to student achievement at 50%, an amazing teacher who had been part of the work for 8 months stood up and testified on behalf of the system in the face of many colleagues who were testifying otherwise. And she said something that I thought was so powerful, and I think it's a mindset that we've got to figure out how to make pervasive amongst our teaching population. And she said, you know, teaching is my calling, but it is not my right. And if I don't do it well, I should be held accountable. And to me, it was such a powerful sentiment. And I think because of her involvement, she didn't see this system as something that was done to her or against her, but something that was done with her on behalf of her students. I'll also offer, just to your point, that when we started thinking about this evaluation work, we looked at all of our data across the system, and your experience as a first-year teacher mirrored nearly all of our teachers in our system. 98% of all of the ratings that we gave in HISD at that time were exceeds expectations, so sort of excellent or good. And there's just no way that 98% of all of our teachers were fantastic while our students were performing at the level that they were. So there was absolutely a strong need to do something about it. And this system that we put into place gave us a multiplicity of factors to look at in determining a teacher's outcomes. And when you think about sort of these observable factors, we talk to principals. I think when we get to lessons learned, I'll talk about one of the mistakes that we made is assuming that all of our administrators were ready to implement this new system and really understood what they were looking for in the back of the classroom. And if you sort of talk to someone off the record and say, why did you give all of the teachers on your campus really high ratings? Part of the issue was, one, lacking the professional courage to face down the teacher that I've been telling you you're great for the last 15 years, but it turns out you're not. And how do we start having that conversation about how you can improve? Additionally, feeling like once I actually acknowledge that there are things that you can improve on, I'm not actually sure how to help you. Because that's not what I was trained to do when I came to this job as a principal and school administrator 20 years ago. So just as it relates to this idea of how do we hold teachers accountable and what should we hold teachers accountable to, something that Morgan said earlier today really resonated with me, and that is that we may not have perfect measures, but we've got to start somewhere. And that's what we did in HISD, and I think it was really inspiring to start the work of moving the needle in our district from telling everyone they were great to getting some really good, reliable data about where teachers were performing, not just so that we could lop off the ends and say, we're going to fire low-performing teachers and promote high-performing teachers, but so that we could look at the middle of our bell curve where the vast majority of our teachers were and start asking ourselves, what are we going to do to help mediocre teachers become good and eventually excellent?
The New Teacher Project has done two over a period of years, really good studies, and one was the widget effect, and we've touched on that. With technology we can do, but the whole idea of these really off the charts, highly effective, if it really has to be, we're probably never going to have highly effective in every single classroom, but is there a way to leverage those teachers? And then a second study that really impressed me was the irreplaceables. And it's to your point, Ann, I think you did a fabulous job on that, which is that the system, the principal in the school, because children's achievement is not a profit motive, there's nothing there. So if there's pushback and awkwardness for the principal, I mean, shoot, maybe her husband is on the deacon in Mineola or something. I don't know, but it's easier not to push back on that. And so we lose our irreplaceables, those teachers that we cannot do without. We lose them at the same rate that we keep the ones that really would be better if they go home. So let's start with you because we've been doing it.
I just want to jump in.
Yeah, how do we address that?
One of the things that I recognized leading human capital in HISD for 4 years was that so many of our school leaders did not see human capital management as the most significant lever for improving student achievement. It was sort of something that we were forcing upon them to do in addition to all of the many things that they had to do to run their campus. And it was completely mind-boggling to me coming out of Teach for America, which is an organization built solely on human capital and the idea that human capital drives results, and looking at some of our charter partners in the Houston community that their bread and butter is human capital. For our leaders, it was a new concept for many of them, and I won't make a generalization about all of them, but for many of them, to think of human capital as a student achievement lever. And so we had to step up as a human capital team and help our principals figure out how to do it. And so to your point, Houston was one of the districts in the irreplaceables study, and one of the things that it brought forward was that low-performing teachers received the same number of messages about staying on the campus, staying in their role for another year as high-performing teachers. And if we could just switch that, if we could get our principals to understand that you've got to give the most messages to your highest performers, you've got to go to that teacher in October and say, I hope you're coming back next year because I literally cannot turn the school around without you. I mean, we're talking about some low-lift measures. But then on a system-wide level, we started to think about what could we do to help change the human capital equation in our district, especially on behalf of some of our lowest performing schools. And so we put in extra supports to help our principals learn how to sell their campus when they're interviewing. We gave them access to our talent pool far earlier than any other schools so that they could get some of the best talent and attract it to their campuses. But I think there are some system-wide solutions that have to be put in place, but there has to be an acknowledgement on the part of systems that we have to help our school leaders understand how to use human capital and really see it as a lever for increasing student achievement.
Anybody else who would want to add on that question?
Yeah, and I think Dallas ISD is doing a really good job. And one thing that they did is they tied principal evaluation to teacher evaluation. So, you know, if I'm scoring a bunch of my friends really high, but yet their scores are really low and, and the surveys are really low, I'm going to get docked. Like, I'm going to get hit both ways, so low and high. So I think that was a big deal. The other thing that Dallas ISD did that I think is key, and the data coming out of it, well, two things. One is I think it was 51% of our lowest performing teachers, by the evaluation, they left. Whether it was they were asked to leave or they chose to leave. Our higher performing teachers, we lost a very small percentage of them. So whether that was retirement or whatever, so that was key. The other thing is before Mike Miles left, he set up the ACE program, which is kind of an accelerated program with, I think, 8 of our most underperforming schools. And they incentivized the distinguished teachers who had been labeled distinguished off of this evaluation. They incentivized them to come to these 8 campuses with the principal to build this like all-star team. And the scores this year are off the charts.
Right.
Like off the charts, proving, once again, that you get the best teachers and leadership.
Right.
And they make the biggest move. It was kind of my point with Mr. Martinez earlier in that question about, was it about the teachers that you put in that all-boys school, or was it about the professional development? Part of it's just opening teachers' minds and giving them a different opportunity to jump into something.
Yeah, but I told you my sad story in that I really believed in '06 because we have the cure, the quality teacher who, that's such a good example. And I really believe, because when we did it in Houston, it predated Obama's effort. But I thought we would have bidding wars for these really outstanding teachers to turn around. But instead, we don't.
Yeah. And
we have some turnaround. But most states are doing more, really, than Texas is doing.
This notion of the irreplaceables, I'm reminded, was it Charles de Gaulle said, the graveyards are full of indispensable men. I feel like if I sit up here much longer, I'm soon to be indispensable. But in truth, that is inevitable. The loss of those irreplaceables are someday going to have to be replaced. And so, how do we move the median, if I understood your statistics correctly, farther to the better quality teachers, which moves all the numbers forward? But what you've laid out, believe it or not, I actually agree with you. That because what you described was an effort, and the same thing you've described, was developed locally with the local teachers, with the local school boards. It fit very well in those particular school districts. I'm just suggesting that a one-size-fits-all does not work any more than some of the president's ideas have, whether it's President Bush or President Obama, haven't worked because it's trying to do too much to everybody.
I want to hear from Rick. He's
So
got his hand up.
I just want to pick up. I think that local solutions are needed, and that's the only way you're going to get buy-in of the local people and so forth. That having been said, I think you went too far. That
From the left and the right, Travis.
You can't expect the teachers in all 1,000 districts of Texas to know what the competition from Germany is. And those people are, in fact, competing with Germany, they're competing with Korea, they're competing globally. And what we know internationally is what can be expected for kids to know, which is hard to know locally. It's hard to know how far you can take the kids locally until you see that other places are doing this and give that example. That's a statement about not giving up on the measuring stick, which is something that can come from Austin and possibly even from Washington. I know you can't say the word Washington in Texas, but it can come from people who have the full understanding of where the country has to be going and where the state of Texas has to be going if the state of Texas is going to continue to be an engine of economic growth. And it's not going to be if it doesn't keep up with these places in the rest of the world. So splitting this idea that locally is where decisions should be made, which I completely agree with, from the decisions to do what. And to do what is hard to develop locally.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I will just say, I was also president of the board during Katrina. And I'm here to tell you, if you have a hurricane in Louisiana, and they had really low standards back then, and Kent, maybe some of you remember, those kids crossed the Sabine River, and they came to Texas, and we really lobbied hard not to be held accountable for those children because the standards were so low. So I mean, I think, like Rick says, there's a reason to have standards that, because kids cross the Sabine River. All right, we want to have questions from everybody, but we have, what do we have? 10 minutes, Courtney, is that right? We have 10 minutes? 5 minutes? How many? How many? Well, because I have a 14? All right. Okay, so one thing, because I think we've talked about this a lot, and it's really, this is the heart of it. Because I think there are some things that maybe people are on different pages on. Okay, so everybody gets to jump in on this. Given the 3 largely unsuccessful legislative sessions on this issue, how do we move forward? And as part of that, I'm going to combine 2 questions here. I mean, it's political pressure. The teachers' organizations are highly organized, and if they can get out thousands and thousands of emails to folks, that's a part of it. How do we get teachers favorably engaged and get the political will changed in terms of that? And what's our path forward given the fact that we've had 3 unsuccessful legislative sessions?
Ooh, would you look at the time?
Okay, you're going to get the first award for sense of humor.
Hey, I'm going to ask Courtney in the back or Cameron if y'all would take a little picture for me so I can tweet this blood lady out. I'd appreciate it.
Anybody have any lipstick that'll make
Yeah.
it look like blood?
Okay, who wants to start? You want to start, Stacey?
I'm happy to jump in.
All right.
So, and I've said this to John Fitzpatrick at Educate Texas, you can't wait until you've already decided what the bill looks like to call teachers in and say, will you testify on this? It's not going to work. We've got to get them engaged now. So there are certain things being talked about, teacher prep, like teacher prep programs. Get us involved now. Let's talk about it now, kind of like developing a teacher evaluation. Don't wait until you have the framework put together and say, hey, this is what we're looking at. But I think that we can actually get them to get, first of all, it's harder to move on a positive, right? So if we're trying to make something, say yes to something, it's different than getting people rallied around to say no. That's why teachers' unions have a much easier time of it. I think we've got to get people to the table, and we can't tell them what to think. It's okay that there's some disagreement, right? Because in that disagreement, we should come up with a better solution.
Right.
Something that we can all agree to. And I think that's the biggest thing I think happens is it's this way or this way. We have to find middle ground. And somebody else said something earlier in the discussions is if we try something and it doesn't work, don't scrap it. Don't scrap it.
And you said you were organizing teachers. Are you having any live?
Yeah. So
Okay, well, so tell us about
So we're
those.
meeting, in Dallas, we meet with the TEI as the evaluation. We meet with that team. We talk to teachers about things that are working and aren't working. We feed that information in from principals also. And so they're making adjustments and tweaks. And then they come back and say, here are the adjustments and tweaks that we've made. Check it out, try it out. So when you keep them engaged with really good communication, I think we're afraid of what we don't know, right? And so if we can keep that communication going, I think we have more and more teachers that are going to be willing to testify.
But this is just in Dallas, really, right? There's nothing. So are you working statewide with Stand for Children in this effort?
Not yet,
Okay.
but we will.
Let
So come
me-
to Houston.
Let me jump in here on
I'm
from
going to
legislative
Nacogdoches,
point of view.
actually.
Come on, come on. We've got plenty of folks that need to talk to you. But legislatively, I'll confess, somewhat surprised by the Supreme Court's ruling recently. I would strongly encourage all of you and the educators in the room, while I absolutely agree with Judge Willits and the concurring opinions that is the province and of the legislature to develop how we do fund public education and public education generally, I also think that some of the pressure has been taken off. And too often about the only exercise we get in the legislature is kicking the can down the road. And I was looking forward to this being the public education session. That's what I've been telling folks, that the 83rd it was water, and last time it was transportation, and this time it was public education's turn. We need the pressure to be told from each of your members in your districts to your representatives and your senators that let's focus on education. Don't let some of the things that are being discussed, which I think are constructive about the tax side of the equation, take away from where the education, where the focus should be, and that's on the education part of the equation. That's my, I won't say fear, but my concern going this session, that because of the court's ruling, maybe we've shifted the emphasis over back onto the tax side, which I don't think is what we need. We do need a concentrated focus. I hate that we're losing Chairman Aycock in the House, but I know we have some very able members that can step into his shoes and will focus on education. So I'm ever the optimist. The glass is always half full to overflowing. So I think we can do some good work. But squeaky wheels, as mail, email, visits, we are very aware of those things. And between teachers and retired teachers, it's hard for us to get a breath sometimes. So, and that's a good thing.
Nobody could have set it up anybody. I mean, he's told us what it's going to take. And so, can we do it? The rest of it, that is what it's going to take. Rick, do you have anything or
I would
Diane
just
to add?
give a slightly different view of the Supreme Court decision in Texas. I thought it was absolutely the right decision. Kent Grusendorf, who's pushed on this for a long time, got a solution that said, let's let the legislature make the decisions that we need to make. And I thought it was support for you.
No, it's what we're supposed to do. We just don't do it all the time. That's the problem.
Well, maybe that applies also to the schools, that they're supposed to teach kids and don't always do it. And somehow they have to have a little more structure to it. But that's the same story.
Once again, Rick, we find ourselves in agreement.
All right. Anybody else have anything that you want to add? Like, how can we get teachers more organized, or what we need to do for the legislative session? Ann?
Well, I'll just offer around this idea of organizing and involving teachers. When I was at HISD in the human capital role and we designed the new teacher performance appraisal, again, we had teachers involved from every SDMC and subcommittees, et cetera. And yet, we still had folks who felt like this was something that was done to them and not for them and not on their behalf. And I think that as much as we earnestly and truly sincerely tried to involve teachers in the process, we still came away from it with people feeling like something had been done to them. And so I think that there are even greater efforts that have to be made even sooner in processes, and certainly, to your point, before decisions have been made. And let folks know when you're in a conversation where your input matters a lot, and maybe where it matters a little bit less because the following decisions have already been made, but we have so much more that we have to do to bring teachers into the conversation and along in the conversation, especially given some of the things that have been said throughout the day about the pervasive mindset within the profession that fair means everyone gets treated the same instead of everyone gets what they need, and both that in terms of how teachers are treated and how students are treated. But we have a mindset that exists in education that is many, many, many decades old, that we have to start combating in a way that really seriously involves teachers.
Great.
Very good.
Questions from the audience? Anybody have any questions, burning issues? Yes, Chairwoman.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about the accountability system. Have you been involved in that next generation assessment?
And who are you asking?
Oh, yes.
I know I can't see what
Stacey.
Yes.
Yes. About the Next Generation Assessments and Accountability Commission, have you been tuning in to the meetings and that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah, a little bit, not a lot.
Okay, I wish I had known about you. I really.
Okay, so we've made a connection,
Yeah.
Chase information, don't
I
forget.
mean, I went all over the state, and somehow I missed you. I don't know how I missed you. But I was wondering, the next generation of accountability that will be in 2018 after this next legislative session. The testing assessments area, about 55% of the overall indexes that are going to be used. Have you looked at those? And I mean, do you think that's striking about the right balance of all the things that are in there? I don't know if you've really looked at that new accountability piece.
Yeah, I can't talk to that. Honestly, I
Okay.
can't talk to that. And are you talking about teacher eval? So the accountability on the teacher
No,
eval?
I'm talking
or
about
just-
the actual accountability system, the way that it's being applied. What's going to end up with the A through F system and all of that kind of thinking.
I wish I could talk to it, honestly. I've
Yeah,
had my
no,
head
it's
down
okay.
in Dallas
We'll
doing our
talk.
stuff. Okay.
We'll talk.
Okay, and Trustee Eastman?
So I would like to know if Stacey would be interested in being like a model for other cities. Because I will say, even though all the preliminary work we did on our evaluation system, we did not do a good job of staying engaged at the ground floor and tweaking and moving as we implemented it. And the only kind of active organized teacher voice has been the one that's just said, absolutely not, this is horrible, you know, throw it out, and we're gonna sue you because 7 people got put on a growth plan as a result of this evaluation system. And so, you know, I just like to know how we can put people in touch, because Stanford Children and Houston just kind of withered, like what it was intended to be, never really gained traction and grew, and I think it would be a great kind of vehicle maybe to revive that, a third kind of voice in our system that was more organized. Because I talk to people all the time that'll say, well, I think what we have is actually a lot better than what we had before, but don't tell anyone I said so, you know. And we do have a lot of work to do around our assessment piece, because I think we could stand to reduce the percentage and gain a lot of goodwill from some different teachers and simplify it, because having 2 measurements is pretty complicated for every single teacher. So,
I'd be happy to talk. I wish.
yeah, no, I don't want,
Hold-
like, you don't
hold
have to
on.
come here
I'm
and
going to
be a
Nacogdoches.
jerk, but
She said she's going to Nacogdoches first.
we need it, you
Keep
know?
that in mind. All right.
We need it in the state.
Yeah.
If you can organize his back, I think
I
we've
tell you
converted
what.
him. You've just got to get his
But it's
back.
kind of what we're talking about. There needs to be a model, a centrally,
Yeah.
some design plan that works with all the information with it, so you compare worldwide, et cetera. But then that model needs to be taken and implemented and tailored in school districts.
And facilitated and
with
whatever.
a
so they
local
can-
group
yep,
who get
absolutely.
the issues and are passionate as you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Precisely, you're out of your hole.
It only took me an hour.
Okay, anybody else? Our time's up, isn't it? Oh, okay, I can't see your face, yeah. She needs a mic, maybe? Here it comes.
And I got your picture for you.
Thank you, Courtney.
Representative Clardy, I'm curious if this next session is the session of education, what would you like to see accomplished?
That's a good one. Many things we've talked about here. I would like to see further reduction of the STARS test. I do want to see us fund public education appropriately. I think there have been cuts that have never been made up. That said, this is not a solution you solve by throwing more money is not always the answer. One thing I think we do have to do, and this is more from a higher education standpoint, we've talked about it a lot. Counseling in public education doesn't need to be the end of your junior year, what college are you going to go to. We've talked about it a lot, but we need to do a better job of integrating public education and higher education, you know, begin with the end in mind. And so as these students come up, they need to be having counseling early on, identifying aptitudes. Now, I'm not suggesting some of the European models where, okay, you're now going to study this, and you're going to go to the athletic camp, and you're going to go do these things. You know, this isn't Aldous Huxley. We're not going to turn people into deltas too. So what we do need to do, though, is have a better move, make counseling a priority of students and hopefully with the parents, and identify those aptitudes. I believe strongly that we're better served as a society if we can help students identify what they're good at and help them become great, rather than find things that are bad and hope they'll become mediocre. That seems a tremendous waste of talent and resource. Every child has something that they really have the ability to do, and they all have they all have importance. And of whatever may be, at some point in their life, it'll be the most important thing available to the people around them. So that would be something I hope we can do. So we're going to have to fund the counseling because we can't do it internally with current budgets as I understand it. So that would be another thing. But when we do need to address, although the Supreme Court said it's not unconstitutional, it also said it's not exactly equal either. So we're going to have to do some things to address the inequities, disparities between certain regions of the states and school districts, et cetera. So that's what I hope we focus on.
So there's one more question. It's going to be from me to Representative Clardy, since I assured him that there would be no gotcha questions. So you're on the Higher Education Committee. You're chair of the Post-Secondary Readiness and Workforce Readiness Subcommittee, which is a very important goal for all of us. Agree or disagree that if every student had an effective teacher, your job on that committee would look much, much easier?
That would be, that answers you. That's what I was going to say. I would agree with that. But I will also add to this, and this is the strength I think that our teachers struggle with the most. More importantly, I would say, than the teacher in the classroom are the parents who get the kid to the classroom. And now that's something we can't legislate. I wish I could provide a loving home for every student in Texas. That's not within our authority or ability. I think our teachers feel the same way. So we're doing the best we need to do better to do the best we can with what we've got.
All right, thank you, panel.